What's up everyone? Today we are going to be painting Johannes from Zombicide's Green Horde. And I am really excited to show you him because I think he is one of the best miniatures I have turned out so far. I really did a lot of, I got out of my comfort zone and did a lot of things that I have not done yet, like I tried non-metallic metal. And I actually think it turned out pretty well. I also started with different colored bases and brought up the highlights. And overall, I think he is definitely one of the best that I've done so far. I'm very proud of him. So I'm excited to show him to you and see what you think. So let's get down to the table and I'll show you how I've done it. Alright, for Johannes we are starting with zenithal highlights. We did an undercoat with a flat black primer, and then I used a white primer and did from 45 degrees and then directly down from the top. And I'm using primarily the Army Painter, the Wargamer Regiment brush. I am also using a Kolinsky Sable Hair brush, the Masterclass. This is for a real fine detail. You can see it's basically a number 2 and a number 0 style brush. I'm starting with Vallejo's Model Color Flat Flesh, and that I am painting in all of his flesh, obviously. So we're doing his face and his hands, and I did try to get a little bit of extra white, even though it wasn't quite zenithal style. A little bit of extra white primer on his face and his hands so that I didn't have to do quite as many layers of this bright flesh color. The Vallejo's Model Color Flat Flesh does cover pretty well, but it does take multiple layers if you are starting with black primer. So the white primer helps to speed that process along, since you're not fighting with a really dark undercoat coming through. But I did do multiple layers either way. Next is P3's Umbral Umber and Vallejo Model Color's Flat Red. And the Umbral Umber is about, I would say about 75%, and then 25% the Flat Red, maybe even less, maybe 80-20. And I just wanted to give a reddish tone to the brown, and we are painting all of his cloak with this color. And what you'll see is, other than the face and the hands, which I just laid down a base color and then moved on to the next section. And the reason is that the face it requires a lot of different steps, and you'll be jumping back and forth between trying to get the skin tone down and also trying to do the facial hair and the hair on top of his head. But other than that, the rest of this miniature I'm going to do it's section by section, so a little different than how I normally paint, or how you might be instructed to paint in the beginning. You can see here I did the entire coat. It's kind of a milk chocolatey color, a little bit of like a velvet chocolate here, so just a reddish brown is what you're going for. And then, so I'm not exactly sure why I showed you that, because I just explained it and you can see it on the model, but there you go. What we're doing next is I am getting all of the flat areas and the raised areas. In other words, I'm leaving just this dark brown color in the recesses. So anything that is raised or anything that is flat, I'm going to paint those in flat red with just about 10% of the brown in it. So I'm using the same two colors, Umbral Umber and the flat red. And those two piles that I had made there, you'd seen on the wet palette, I started to blend those two together. And so on the left hand side you have the most amount of reddish brown, on the right hand side is pure flat red, and then in between that is varying levels. So I made it about what I wanted in the mixture of the two, with it more red than brown. And here you can see in that those dark recesses have started to look almost black, and your eyes are now seeing that top layer as a reddish brown, even though it is primarily red. And then here we're going to even less of the brown color, more flat red. This one here is all the way at the right hand side of the spectrum, so it is mostly just flat red for, again, painting the raised portions, and a slightly less amount of the of the flat areas. So this one is probably the first highlight. We'll consider it our first highlight of the miniature. But here you want to look a lot of times at the top of the miniature the same way that the zenithal highlight would be. Look at the very top of the miniature and look down. Whatever you see and is not in a clear recess, those are the things that you're going to want to paint. So here I brought in white, and from this point I'm going to be actually highlighting that flat red. So the flat red I'm making, adding a little bit of white to make it go towards a pink. Now we don't want it to ever get too pink. Not too pink. We don't want it to approach pink, I should say. You want it to stay red. You just want it to get to be a brighter and brighter red. You could add yellow if you want it to take on a more orangish tone. If you want it to stay kind of muted, you could just go straight to orange. But you can see here the cloak is starting to take on many different layers. And I'm showing you the colors again, but the exact same process I am now doing for, there are these little leather bits underneath his, I guess it's a skirt. It's kind of hard to tell what exactly each of these pieces are, considering I'm not, a 1700s lordling that is running around with a bow and arrow. So it's a little difficult to understand what pieces you're painting, but I use that same dark brown color, the same red brown that I used for the base of the cloak. I am also painting that on those little leather pieces that are sticking out the bottom. Then they are each in little squares that have a maybe a millimeter and a half in between each of them. And so each of those little squares, I'm going back and I'm painting the bottom 2/3 in flat red. So this one we're having less highlights because it's just a much smaller area. You don't have to do as many layers. But I'm doing the bottom 2/3 in this flat red. And then again, we're coming back with white and we're lightening it up. We don't want to go to pink. But now I'm taking just the edges. So I'm edge highlighting each of these little squares with about a 75 red, 25% white mixture, just to give it really good definition. Then I'm going back with black, Vallejo Model Color's black here, and each of those little leather pieces has a dot on it, and you want to make sure you water down this color a lot to make sure that it covers easily. If you're having to fight the paint and try to really press it on there, there's a good chance it's going to go way farther than the little ball that you're trying to paint, and it's going to go all over, and you're going to have to redo the red and so on and so forth. So you want the paint to work with you. So after you've painted those black dots, to make them look like a little bit of a shiny metallic, you're going to take some Vallejo Model Color white, and this is pure white, and you're going back and adding the smallest little dot. And on the left hand leg, I'm putting them near the bottom. On the right hand leg, I'm putting them near the top. And that's just because of the angle of the leg. And the idea is this is actually coming more from the floor than it is from up above. So this is the Reikland Flesh shade. And with Reikland Flesh shade, we're going to now shade the flesh. So I'm going to work now a little bit on the flesh. Now that I got the cloak done and the sides of his face I can work on without worrying about getting red all over it, I'm more willing to go back and work on the rest of his flesh. So you'll get his hands and his face and just slap it on the same way you always do with a wash, and then come back with a clean brush and get off any globs that are pooling in areas where there shouldn't be shadows. Now this is the Vallejo's Nocturna line, the Nocturna Shadow. Nocturna Shadow you do not want to use straight. You want to mix this a little bit with the flat flesh. And what I do here is it looks really weird at first, but you have to remember there's going to be facial hair. We're also going to do highlights. We're also going to bring back up that flat flesh on top of the Reikland Flesh shade that we've done. So there's going to be a lot of layers going on top of this. So even though it looks a little weird right now, you'll kind of see later on how it really puts a nice edge on everything. And what I'm doing is I'm putting it underneath the chin, around the neck. It's off screen. I'm trying to bring it back up here. Around the base of his beard, the base of his beard on both sides actually, and around his hairline. It's way too thick to be left like that, obviously, and that's why it's good to put it on early, because I'm going to come back, I'm going to put the highlights over top of it, and I'm going to thin it down to a very, very minuscule line. But here's the important part, is you want to put it in the eye sockets. Putting it in the eye sockets is going to make your eyes look so much better, and that's probably the one thing that you can't skip over. If you're not comfortable with putting it on everything else, you feel like you might mess it up, skip it. But I would say put some black or some dark brown in with your flesh shade just to darken it down just a little bit. Not your flesh shade, whatever shade of flesh you're using, I should say. So here I'm using the flat flesh to go back and get rid of the Reichland flesh shade that's in any of the spots that I want to be brighter. You mix in a little bit of that brown and put that in the eye socket. This is a step that I learned by watching a couple different YouTube videos that had said different ways of doing eyes, and one of the things that they seem to all repeat was start with a shadow in the eye socket, and when you come back and you put in the white dot for the eyes, like right here I'm using ivory. When you put in that white dot, it actually frames it really well. It also makes it really easy to clean up. So if the dot's a little bit too big, when you come back with your flesh color, you can shape the eye and make the eye smaller and smaller and smaller until it looks correct and isn't just some big giant blob. So that was a lot to tell you about just put the shade in the eyes. So there you go. So now we have fairy flesh, and you don't want to do straight fairy flesh just like you don't want to do the straight Nocturna shadow. You want to mix it a little bit with the flat flesh. And then I'm going to come back and do just the highlight areas. So we have the forehead, we have the nose, we have the cheekbones, and the lips. We're also going to do the top of the hands, the fingers, and the knuckles, and then also a little bit on the ears here, on basically the edge of the ears. So I'm just trying to look at the model from the top here. And as we're looking at him from the top, I'm seeing that, you know, that portion of his hands would be getting bright light, and we want to do that. So now highlight skin. The way I like to use this one is it is super thin down. It is almost like a wash. So I use it straight out with my smallest brush. I use it straight out of the bottle, and I just sort of tip his nose and then put a little bit on his forehead there, where his forehead's going to be a little glossy. You know, he has sweat, he has angles on his forehead where the sun is shining on, and a little bit on his exposed cheekbone there. I think I put some on the knuckles. That one I might not do again. I mean, it's so thin, you would need multiple layers to make it actually stand out. But I'm thinking about like the logic of where you're putting it. And you would think that the face is closer to the sun, so it's going to have a brighter sunlight on it. The hands are farther from the sun, and so therefore it is a little darker. And maybe that brightest highlight isn't needed. So here I'm using the Vallejo's Model Color Black, and I'm just doing the dot on the eyes. You saw me wipe off some of the paint first on my thumbnail, just to make it so it wasn't as thick when it went on. So here I have Vallejo's Model Color's Flat Brown, and we're going to be working on all of the facial hair, including the hair on top of his head. So we're just going to coat all of it in flat brown. That is our base color. And that'll be the mustache, the beard, and the hair. Next up, I'm adding some yellow ochre from Model Color to the flat brown. And this I am going to dry brush. So this is about a 50-50 mix, and I'm dry brushing it in there to just get some variation in the colors. So he has some light brown, some dark brown, just like everyone's natural hair. It's not all one color. There's a whole bunch of different shades mixed in there. Even the darkest of hair has some lighter shades mixed in, which makes it look, you know, realistic and alive. And that's what you want to do. I also did that on the mustache and the beard. Here I've added a light gray color, and I am going to just lightly dry brush a couple of strands. Johannes looks like he's probably in his 40s, so he's going to have some gray. So I put a little bit of gray on the top of his head and a little bit of gray on his beard and his mustache. Not a ton. You can also see how little of the Nocturna shadow is left. I've thinned it so much by putting all the other colors around that now it just sort of frames the hair and it makes the hair really stand out. So I have Model Color Prussian Blue, a color I haven't used before. I just bought it for this model. And this is a color that maybe you might not want to use. It's going to be up to you. It depends on how closely you want to follow the game artwork. But all of his undershirt and underpants, they're kind of like a flannel that goes underneath everything. And you only see it in a couple of areas. You see it right below that leather and right below his knee pad. And then you see it in between his shoulder pad and his elbow pad. And then that is about it. So it's very little. But I think that that color of blue mixed with the red from the cloak makes him look a little Superman, Spider-Man-y. Here's Azure. Azure is a gray blue, and so I just use this straight just to give a little bit of a highlight. I mean, you can barely see this blue color anyway, so I don't think it's that big of a deal. You don't need to spend so much time highlighting it, but I did want to give it, you know, a little bit of dimension, especially since I'm spending so much time on this model. I think that not spending time on one portion of it is going to make that portion stand out in a bad way. So I made sure to get all of the little pieces that would be, you know, a little bit lighter than everywhere else. So we have Raw Sienna, which is a khaki tan color. And we are going to paint the... I don't know if they're really gauntlets. They sort of look like cloth with metal balls on them in the artwork. But I'm not sure. They might be gauntlets. They might still be called gauntlets. Because I'm pretty sure greaves are gloves. And then gauntlets are the wrist protectors. I might be wrong. Tell me in the comments if I have that completely backwards. Or just completely wrong in general. But this color here is what we want the base color to be. And so now we're going to take buff. Buff is going to be mixed a little bit with that raw sienna. Mostly buff though. And then that's going to be the top color. So we're using the pure raw sienna as the shadow, and the buff and raw sienna as the top color, the brighter color. So you can see there, both colors are there. And I wet blend along the edges. It was just really hard to show in the video, the wet blending, because it's such a small area to be behind the camera and then stick the clean brush in between and wet blend them. It doesn't show up well, and my hand was in the way the entire time, or I couldn't see and I thought I would just mess it up. So that's what I did. I wet blended them just to make sure that they would look nice. And then I used Mechanicus Standard Gray to color in the little metal balls that are on these greaves. Now I'm calling them greaves, gauntlets before, whatever, his wrist protectors. And then the same thing that I did with the bottom metal balls. I'm going back with some ivory. And I think I'm going to use pure white on the bottom ones. If I use pure white on the bottom ones, you might want to use pure white on the top ones. Whatever color you use for the bottom, you should be using for the top. And then I'm just putting a little tiny dot. So here's a close-up of it. So you can see they just look like little metal balls there. So here is German Gray. And this might be the first time I've used German Gray as well. But I'm using German Gray. It's a really nice black leather look. So it's not pure black. Usually I don't like to paint any large area of a model in pure black. I think it ends up looking like pleather rather than leather. So I used the German gray to paint the boots, and then here I'm using German gray mixed with buff. And that German gray mixed with buff, I'm actually going to paint solidly this front area of the shoe, which is a metal portion on the shoe. So the shoe looks like it's leather, but then it has like a toe guard on it. So I wanted to paint this in this color, and this is the first time we're going to do some non-metallic metal. Now, I spent a lot more time doing the non-metallic metal on the shoulder pads, elbow pad, and knee pads. But here, what I've done is I'm just trying to give it a little bit of a brightness shine that looks natural and makes it look like it's metal. And what I've done is each time I'm adding a little bit more buff, a little bit more buff, a little bit more buff, and coming up towards the point on the shoe. So the shoe is sort of in a pyramid shape. And as I did it, I went around and put more and more buff in, and then at the very end I put a lot of buff and then came back and drew sort of a line near the top and then edge highlighted it. And I thought that it came out really nice. Now I went back to a mid-tone. I used the German gray and like one of the first stages of buff that I used, and I came back and highlighted the boot with that. So it adds a little bit of a leather shine to the boot. So I wonder what you guys think of that. I wonder how you like the boots. I'm not super impressed with how they came out. I'm much happier with the model as a whole and some of the other things that I was able to do. But let me know how that works. Here's the purple, some raw sienna, and flat brown. Now what we're doing here is the purple and raw sienna I mixed first. And then I added the flat brown up until I got this mauve color. So it's a purplish brown, but I didn't want it to be dark. And that's what's going to be in his like leather jerkin. This is all of his chest and this bottom area where I'm painting to start here. So you want to paint his chest in that and that bottom area. It's going to take you a couple coats, as pretty much everything is on this model if you've got it thinned down right. That's what he looks like with one solid coat on. There is a little bit there in the back corner that you need to make sure you hit. You don't want to forget that part. And then all I've done is added a little bit of white. And as I added a little bit of white, I went back and got the raised portions and some of the center portions and started edge highlighting. And then each time I would add a little bit more white to it and go back and do a smaller portion of that corner and a smaller portion of the highlights. As you can see here, that it comes out to be a pretty good pretty good lighting for that piece of material. Then on his chest, we're doing the exact same thing. We're trying to get the ripples on it. There looks like there's some folds in the leather pieces. So I think this is leather, but it does look like it's colored, so it's probably dyed. This one I did not show the color, but this is buff. I always use buff for the stitches and ropes. I think that is a perfect color for what you would think like a cotton piece of rope would be, or maybe like a piece of twine that was being used. So there you go, you can see what it looks like. Oh, I'm showing right here that I had actually forgotten those little pieces of the cloak, and it turns out that they are the cloak. I went back and painted them the exact same way that I had painted the cloak before. So here are all the colors that I will be using now to do non-metallic metal. So we have German gray, whole red, which is a reddish brown color. Now what we're doing here is we're taking a little bit of that yellow color, I believe it was the yellow ochre, and mixing it into mixing it a little bit with that red brown. So we're going to bring this yellow ochre to like a real dusty color, and then I'm putting a little bit of the German gray in there too to darken it down, and I'm just mixing it through until it has like this dark sand you know, I don't know what color to really describe it. It's obviously like a khaki tan, but it's kind of dark. I'm going to paint. This is one of the only things where I'm going to paint most of the miniature, all the spaces in. That I don't think that sentence made sense. I'm going to paint most of the spaces where this paint color goes, even though it's not one singular space. Then what I'm going to do is go back and I'm going to do just a single area at a time. So you saw how I painted his shoulder there. Now I went back and I painted. What I'm showing you here is that you have to pick, if you're going to do non-metallic metal, where the light is coming from. So I'm saying the light is coming from up above his right hand shoulder. It's coming down and it's in that kind of straight line there. So I painted all of the areas. So you can see on his right arm there, I've already done the non-metallic metal. I had to test it out and make sure I knew what I was doing before I tried to record it. So I did that first. I did some of his other pieces, but I did one piece at a time and focused on that piece until I was done. Now I've taken pure whole red and I watered it down a lot. I made it pretty much a wash. But I put a ton of it in there. And then what I've done is I went and I first made sure it was in the crack of his armor there, in the little crevice. And I took my brush, wet the brush again, even though this is very watered down, and came from the inside of that crack and brushed out. So I'm moving towards the middle. The middle is where the brightest is going to be, where the brightest reflection is going to be. But I wanted to put that in there first, and then you're going to go and lighten everything up. So I have yellow ochre and lemon yellow. And this is where it's hard to explain exactly how to do it step by step, because it takes so much of just doing it again, doing it again, doing it again, and hoping each time that it looks better. Really, that's all you can do. But this is how I did it. So I took the yellow ochre and the lemon yellow. This is mostly yellow ochre with some lemon yellow in it. And so you can still see that base color is coming through because these colors are thinned down. They're quite thin. And so now I've let that dry. Then what I do is I come and I take a much brighter mix of the lemon yellow and yellow ochre. So this is, I would say this is a 50-50 mix of the two. And I put that mostly in the middle. So I paint that mostly in the middle of the two color. I put the mixture mostly in the middle of this piece of armor. Then I go and I pick up the last color that I just did, and I wash along the sides of it. So here, I think I show it in this one. I'm going to put down a line of pure yellow. So this is pure lemon yellow. You can see how bright that is. But you can see below it on the elbow pad, that one's even brighter. So we still have more colors to go. What I'm going to do now is, after I put down that lemon yellow, I go and pick up some of the yellow ochre, and I start in that middle section and just sort of smear it around. So it's almost like wet blending. But instead of trying to get a smooth gradient, you're trying to get, well, you are trying to get a smooth gradient, but it's not a transitional gradient. What you want to see is the center being built up brighter and brighter and brighter every time you do this. So every time you might put a line of lemon yellow 3 or 4 times and do that. Then you come and you do a line of white like I'm doing here. And you'll first start your first couple of them with brushing the yellow ochre and lemon yellow mix. Then you're going to come back and do just a lemon mix. Then you're going to come back and do a white and lemon mix, and each time you're putting a single line of white, and then you're blending with the brighter color each time. So here you can see I'm doing a much brighter color to wash it away with, and each time I've got the colors very thin down. By the time I'm done, I've done probably 15 layers. Here's whole red, and you can see how absolutely thin I have this. Now, about halfway through of all those layers, well, I would say, yeah, about 15 layers have gone by. You can see how bright it is in the center. I take this very, very bright wash, and I come and I wash over everything. And the reason I'm doing this is I'm trying to blend all these colors back together. So yes, it is dulling it down. So I am going to have to go back, put down the white and do it again a couple more times. But at this portion here, I was seeing that the armor was starting to look the way I wanted it to. So I went back in and I did the wash over it to make it all that faded brown color of like dingy gold. Now you can see some of the paint rubbed off, and that's why there is that kind of gash in his shoulder. I'm not a professional painter. I'm not perfect. But I think that it came out pretty damn good for my very first time doing non-metallic metal, and the only practice I got was on those other pads of armor on his body. So I went through and just did that a whole bunch more times. So here's the Umbral Umber again. And this is going to be for all those leather pieces. A little bit more on that non-metallic metal. If you have questions, please leave your question down below. I hope you kind of understand the base way of how I do is I base in one color. Then I do the darkest recesses in the darkest color that I want to use as a very thin down wash. And then ones that are about half as thin down as that, I start with a middle tone color and wash with almost the base tone that I used. Then I use a brighter color and do the wash with the middle color, and then brighter color and wash with that last color, so on and so forth up until the brightest. And I used white as my brightest color because I wanted it to be very reflective since it's gold. And then I used a wash at about that point of the base tone to bring it all back to the same color, but it is a very thin down wash. You don't want to undo everything you did. And then I do it a couple more times with the white and the brightest colors to bring that back up. What you've seen now is I used a dark brown color, Umbral Umber, and then I used flat brown to go and get the top pieces of the wood and some of the brighter leather pieces. Sometimes I like to break up those leather pieces and give them a couple different colors so that it's not just one big patch of dark brown on him. And then here I'm just doing a couple of highlights to really give there some of a variance. The important part here though is that on his right leg there are some scrolls, and I put some dark brown in the top of the scrolls because I'm going to come back and paint it with a blend of white and another color to get it to look like parchment, and the brown makes a really good shadow. So you definitely want to get that in there. So here's the German gray. German gray, again, I'm trying to make some dark leather pieces, and I'm only using this for 2 or 3 main pieces. I'm doing it on his little dagger scabbard on the front. I'm also doing it on... Yeah, okay, so I also did it on that holder that's on his front there, and I also did on the scabbard that is on his back. Well, on his back hip, I should say. So here I am painting up those scrolls. And I used a mixture of, I believe that was buff and ivory, I think. I don't know. I showed the colors there, so whichever two it was there. I believe it was buff and ivory, but it might have been buff and ochre. I'm not 100% sure. But I made it look like parchment, so I just wanted it to be like kind of a dingy off-white color, and I painted that up there. Then Mechanicus Standard Gray is what I'm painting all of the metal pieces. So on the front of the crossbow, the bolt head of the crossbow, and some of the little metal pieces around his belt and leather. There's also a little metal piece on the crossbow holder here. There are some metal pieces on the scabbards and at the end of the sword. So basically every little metal piece that you can see that we haven't done already, you're going to do in that. And then so I'm taking buff again. And as I said before, I like buff for any strings the same way I did on the chest. I'm going through and getting them across the scabbard, and then there's one that is hanging on the holder. And then there's a couple that are on the back of Johannes as well on his sword holder there. You also have the feathers on the bow. And then there's also a couple like string pieces on the bow that I paint as well. Yeah, those string pieces right there. I mean, it doesn't have any actual strings, so you just sort of have to imagine it. But I figured that was a nice way to sort of tie it all together, make it look like it's string. And then there also looks like there's a handle that's made of the same stuff on the opposite side near his hand, so I paint that in there as well. Well, what do you think? I think he looks pretty darn good. He is by far one of the best miniatures that I have turned out so far. I really like the idea of painting each section to get like the best out of it that you can. But one of the things that I did notice is it does take a lot longer to do it that way. So it is a quality versus quantity thing. Do you need to get a bunch of them done, or do you want to get, you know, the best quality miniature that you can get? Doing non-metallic metal does take forever. I spent about 20 minutes on each one of those metal pieces, which he has 6 of. He has the one around his neck, the one around his neck, the shoulder, both elbows, and both knees. And you have to change where you put the highlight on each of them so that they don't look weird. I added a little bit of blood on the rock at the bottom, but that was just as a little extra there. But thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. This was a long one. This was a lot of talking, and it was a lot of fun to paint. I think he looks great. So let me know in the comments below what you want to see painted next. We only have one mini left from the base set, and after that it is on to the bad guys. So I will see you all next time.